The winter of 1944 was not merely cold, it was suffocating. Across the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American soldiers bled into the snow, while German panzers tore through weakened defensive lines. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted with catastrophic violence, catching Allied command off guard and exposing the fragility of the coalition that claimed to be winning the war. In London, Winston Churchill paced the corridors of power with mounting dread. The alliance with America, painstakingly constructed through years of diplomacy, shared sacrifice, and strategic necessity, was the only thing standing between Western civilization and Nazi domination. And now, in the midst of the most critical German counteroffensive of the war, one man threatened to shatter that alliance from within. His name was Bernard Law Montgomery, and he believed the Americans were useless. Montgomery was not simply a general, he was a symbol. To the British public, exhausted and traumatized by 5 years of total war, he represented resilience, the hero of El Alamein, the architect of D-Day's ground campaign, a military genius draped in the mythology of British superiority. But behind the carefully cultivated image of strategic brilliance lay something far more dangerous, a pathological inability to share credit, and almost delusional conviction in his own infallibility, and a contempt for his American allies that bordered on the irrational. Churchill had tolerated Montgomery's ego because Britain needed heroes, but tolerance has limits, and in January 1945, Montgomery crossed a line that would leave Churchill seething with a fury rarely witnessed even by his closest confidants. The context is essential to understanding the magnitude of what Montgomery did. By late 1944, the Western Allies had achieved remarkable success. The Normandy landings, despite their horrific cost, had succeeded. Paris had been liberated. Allied armies were advancing towards Germany's borders. But this success masked deep structural tensions within the command structure. The Americans, led by General Dwight Eisenhower, held supreme command. This was not merely a military decision, it was geopolitical reality. The United States was providing the overwhelming majority of men, materiel, and industrial capacity sustaining the war effort. Britain, bankrupted and exhausted, was a junior partner attempting to maintain the illusion of equal status. Montgomery despised this arrangement. He genuinely believed, that he should command all Allied ground forces, that Eisenhower, a man he considered a political general with no battlefield genius, was incompetent, that American generals were amateurs playing at war, while British professionalism was systematically ignored. The Battle of the Bulge shattered the illusion of easy victory. Hitler's surprise offensive crashed through the American 8th Corps sector with terrifying speed. Entire units were surrounded, communications collapsed, and chaos rippled through the Allied front. In this moment of crisis, Eisenhower made a controversial decision. He temporarily placed American forces north of the German breakthrough under Montgomery's command to stabilize the front and prevent total collapse. It was a pragmatic move born of desperate circumstances. Montgomery interpreted it as vindication. Finally, he thought, the Americans had acknowledged their inadequacy and turned to British competence to save them. What happened next was not merely a failure of judgment, it was an act of staggering arrogance that revealed the depth of Montgomery's contempt for the alliance itself. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference. The battle was still raging. American soldiers were still dying in the frozen forests, and Montgomery stood before international journalists and claimed credit for rescuing the Americans from their own incompetence. He described the situation with thinly veiled condescension. The Americans had stumbled into disaster through poor planning and inadequate generalship, and only British intervention under his command had prevented catastrophe. He spoke of tidying up the battlefield, as if the desperate fighting of American troops was merely a mess requiring his supervision. He positioned himself as the savior of a failing campaign, the adult forced to clean up after incompetent children. The words were carefully chosen to maintain plausible deniability, but the message was unmistakable. The Americans were useless, and Montgomery had saved them. The American press exploded with fury. Soldiers who had fought and died at Bastogne, who had held impossible positions against overwhelming German armor, who had sacrificed everything to hold the line, they watched as a British general claimed their valor as his own achievement. American commanders, already suspicious of Montgomery's ambitions, saw the press conference as something worse than arrogance. It was sabotage, an attempt to undermine American command and resurrect Montgomery's campaign to seize overall control of ground forces.
And in London, Winston Churchill received the news with a horror that quickly transformed into incandescent rage. He understood immediately what Montgomery had done. The alliance with America was everything. It was survival itself. Britain could not win the war alone. Britain could barely sustain itself in the war without American support. The Lend-Lease program, American industrial production, the promise of continued cooperation in the post-war world, all of it depended on maintaining trust between London and Washington. And Montgomery, in a moment of breathtaking narcissism, had placed his personal vanity above the survival of the nation. Churchill had spent years cultivating his relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, carefully managing the delicate balance between British pride and American power. Now Montgomery threatened to destroy that relationship in a single press conference.
To understand why Montgomery committed such a catastrophic miscalculation, one must first understand the man himself, a figure whose military competence was perpetually overshadowed by psychological deficiencies that made him nearly impossible to work with. Bernard Law Montgomery was not simply confident. He operated within a fortress of self-regard so impenetrable that criticism, evidence, and reality itself could not breach its walls. He did not merely believe he was a great general. He believed he was the only great general, surrounded by mediocrities who failed to recognize his genius. This was not the healthy confidence of a battlefield commander. This was pathology masquerading as leadership. Montgomery's formative experiences had created a personality fundamentally incapable of collaboration. His childhood had been marked by emotional distance and maternal coldness that left deep psychological scars. His military career in World War I had taught him that survival required absolute control and meticulous planning, lessons he elevated into religious doctrine. By World War II, Montgomery had developed a command philosophy that prioritized his authority above all else. He demanded complete obedience, rejected input from subordinates, and interpreted any disagreement as evidence of incompetence rather than legitimate strategic debate. His staff learned quickly. You did not question Montgomery. You did not offer alternative perspectives. You executed his vision, or you were removed. This psychological rigidity might have been tolerable if Montgomery had possessed the strategic genius he claimed, but his actual military record was far more ambiguous than British propaganda suggested. El Alamein, his signature victory, had been won with overwhelming material superiority against an exhausted German force at the end of impossibly stretched supply lines. Montgomery had taken weeks to prepare an offensive against an enemy that was starving, outnumbered, and running out of fuel. When he finally attacked, he did so with such caution that Rommel's forces escaped encirclement, a failure Montgomery never acknowledged. His pursuit across North Africa was methodical to the point of sluggishness, allowing German forces to retreat and regroup when aggressive action might have destroyed them entirely. In Sicily, Montgomery's obsessive caution and territorial jealousy had created operational chaos. He changed the invasion plan to prioritize British objectives, then advanced so slowly that German forces evacuated the island before he could trap them. In Italy, his inability to coordinate with American forces and his constant demands for resources produced friction without decisive results. By the time of Normandy, Eisenhower and other Allied commanders had developed a clear understanding. Montgomery was competent at set-piece battles with overwhelming superiority, but he was also maddeningly slow, pathologically unwilling to take risks, and constitutionally incapable of acknowledging mistakes or sharing credit. The Americans represented everything Montgomery despised. They were improvisational where he demanded rigid planning. They were aggressive where he counseled caution. They possessed energy, optimism, and a willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of decisive action, all qualities Montgomery considered reckless amateurism. But beneath his critique lay something more personal and more poisonous: class contempt and cultural superiority. Montgomery came from a British military tradition steeped in imperial arrogance, where colonial wars against technologically inferior opponents had created an illusion of innate British martial superiority. The Americans, with their informal hierarchies, their citizen-soldier ethos, and their lack of rigid class structure, offended his sense of proper military order. He particularly despised Eisenhower, viewing him as a political general who had never commanded troops in combat, a bureaucrat elevated by American influence rather than military merit. Montgomery's preferred command structure would have placed himself as overall ground commander, with Eisenhower relegated to administrative coordination. This was not merely organizational preference. It was Montgomery's sincere belief that only he possessed the strategic vision necessary to win the war. That Eisenhower had been chosen instead represented, in Montgomery's mind, the triumph of politics over competence, of American quantity over British quality. This worldview created a dangerous blind spot. Montgomery genuinely could not perceive how his behavior appeared to others.
When he criticized American generals, he believed he was offering professional assessment. When he demanded resources and priority, he believed he was advocating for sound strategy. When he claimed credit for Allied successes, he believed he was simply acknowledging his actual contribution. The possibility that he might be wrong, that his assessments might be distorted by ego and prejudice, that his allies might have legitimate grievances, these thoughts never penetrated his consciousness. He lived in the universe where his own superiority was axiomatic, and all evidence was interpreted to confirm that predetermined conclusion. The Battle of the Bulge crisis had activated Montgomery's worst instincts. When Eisenhower placed American forces under his temporary command, Montgomery interpreted this not as a practical response to battlefield chaos, but as validation of everything he had been arguing. Finally, the Americans had admitted they needed British leadership. Finally, his superiority had been acknowledged. He arrived at American headquarters with the air of a headmaster arriving to discipline unruly students. American officers, exhausted and traumatized by days of desperate fighting, watched Montgomery conduct his inspection with barely concealed contempt. He criticized their dispositions, their communications, their command decisions, all while American soldiers were still dying to hold positions Montgomery himself would have abandoned. But Montgomery did restore order. His methodical approach, his insistence on clear command structures, his ability to organize defensive positions, these were genuine contributions. American forces stabilized under the clearer command arrangements. The German offensive was contained, then reversed. The crisis passed. Montgomery had played a role in this success, but it was one role among many in a battle won primarily by the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of American troops who held impossible positions until reinforcements could arrive. The heroes of the Bulge were the soldiers at Bastogne, the engineers who blew bridges to slow German advances, the tank crews who fought desperate delaying actions against superior armor. Montgomery had coordinated, he had not saved. Yet when Montgomery stood before those journalists on January 7th, he presented a narrative in which American incompetence had created the crisis and British genius had resolved it. He spoke with the patronizing tone of a superior officer praising brave but simple men who had done their best despite their limitations. He positioned himself as the indispensable man, without whom American armies would have collapsed. And he did all of this while the battle was still being fought, while American casualties were still mounting, while families across the United States were receiving telegrams informing them their sons had died in those frozen forests. The reaction was immediate and explosive. American journalists, who had been carefully monitoring Montgomery's behavior throughout the campaign, recognized the press conference for what it was, an attempt to rewrite history in real time, to steal valor from American troops and transfer it to British command. Newspaper editorials across the United States erupted with fury. Radio commentators questioned why American soldiers were dying under the command of a British general who held them in contempt. Politicians in Washington began asking dangerous questions about command arrangements and whether American forces should remain under any circumstance of British authority.
Winston Churchill learned of Montgomery's press conference while the full scope of its damage was still unfolding across the Atlantic. The initial reports were bad enough, Montgomery claiming credit, the Americans responding with outrage. But as more details emerged, Churchill's anger transformed from irritation into something far more dangerous, the cold, calculating fury of a statesman watching his life's work threatened by an act of staggering stupidity. Churchill had not survived decades of political warfare, had not guided Britain through its darkest hours, had not forged an alliance with America through sheer force of will and diplomatic genius, only to watch it destroyed by a general's ego. Montgomery had committed the unforgivable sin. He had placed personal vanity above national survival. Churchill understood what Montgomery, isolated in his bubble of self-regard, could not grasp. Britain was losing the war, even as it won battles. Not losing militarily, the Wehrmacht was being ground down, Germany's defeat was now inevitable, but losing strategically, losing its position as a great power, losing the ability to shape the post-war world. The British Empire was bankrupt, sustained only by American loans and Lend-Lease supplies. British cities lay in ruins from years of bombing. British manpower was exhausted, with casualty lists that had bled a generation dry. The nation that had stood alone against Hitler in 1940 was now utterly dependent on American support for its continued existence as a major power. And that support was not guaranteed. It was earned daily through careful management of the alliance. Churchill had invested enormous political capital in building his relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. Through hundreds of telegrams, countless hours of transatlantic phone calls, multiple summit meetings, and strategic compromises that often pained him, Churchill had convinced the American president that Britain was a reliable partner worthy of continued support. He had accepted American command of the invasion of Europe despite his own misgivings. He had tolerated American strategic priorities in the Pacific even when they diverted resources from British interests. He had swallowed his pride repeatedly, accepting Britain's subordinate position in the alliance, because the alternative,
trying to fight without American support was unthinkable. Montgomery's press conference threatened to unravel all of this. The American public, reading newspaper accounts of a British general dismissing their soldiers as incompetent while claiming credit for their sacrifices, was turning hostile. American military commanders, already suspicious of British imperial ambitions, saw confirmation of their worst fears, that Britain viewed the alliance as a vehicle for reasserting dominance rather than genuine partnership. And most dangerous of all, voices in Washington were beginning to question whether the United States should continue deferring to British interests in strategic planning. Why should American resources support British imperial ambitions? Why should American soldiers die under British command if British generals held them in contempt? Churchill recognized immediately that this was not merely a public relations crisis, it was a genuine threat to British national security. If the alliance fractured, if American support wavered, Britain would emerge from the war victorious but ruined, unable to maintain its empire, unable to compete with Soviet power in Europe, reduced to secondary status in a world dominated by America and Russia. Everything Churchill had fought for, British greatness, British influence, British survival as a major power, depended on maintaining American goodwill, and Montgomery, with characteristic blindness to anything beyond his own immediate interests, had attacked that foundation. The Prime Minister's response was swift and absolute. Churchill summoned his chiefs of staff and made clear that Montgomery's behavior was intolerable. He dictated a formal statement that would be released to the press, a statement designed not merely to correct the record, but to publicly rebuke Montgomery and reaffirm British support for American command. The statement praised American forces in the strongest possible terms, emphasizing their courage, their sacrifice, and their decisive role in defeating the German offensive. It described the Battle of the Bulge as American victory won primarily through American valor. It positioned Montgomery's role as supportive rather than decisive, important but not central. But Churchill went further. In private communications with Roosevelt and American military leadership, he made clear that Montgomery's views did not represent British policy. He apologized for the press conference, acknowledged the offense it had caused, and reaffirmed British commitment to unified command under American leadership. These were not merely diplomatic pleasantries, they were acts of strategic damage control from a leader who understood that pride was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. Churchill was willing to humiliate his own general publicly if that was necessary to preserve the alliance. Montgomery, characteristically, failed to understand what he had done wrong. When confronted with the controversy, his response revealed the depth of his delusion. He insisted he had simply stated facts. He had coordinated the defense. American forces had indeed been in disarray when he arrived. His interventions had been crucial to stabilizing the front. All of this was true from a certain perspective, but truth without context is often indistinguishable from lies. Montgomery had told a technically accurate story that created a fundamentally false impression, and he genuinely could not comprehend why this was problematic. His inability to grasp the political dimension of military command was a fatal flaw. Montgomery understood tactics, logistics, operational planning, the mechanics of warfare, but he did not understand that war is politics by other means, that alliance warfare requires constant negotiation and mutual respect, that command is as much about managing relationships as managing battles. To Montgomery, these concerns were irrelevant distractions from the purity of military logic. If Americans were offended by his assessment, that was their problem. If his statements caused political complications, that was Churchill's concern. His job was to win battles, and winning battles required honest assessment uncontaminated by political considerations. This mindset was not uncommon among British officers of Montgomery's generation. They had been trained in an imperial system where British superiority was assumed, where colonial subjects and foreign allies were expected to accept British leadership without question, where class hierarchy and cultural confidence created an impermeable sense of righteousness. Montgomery had commanded forces in India, Egypt, and across the empire, contexts where British authority was absolute and local populations had no voice in strategic decisions. The idea that he should adjust his behavior to accommodate American sensibilities struck him as absurd, a corruption of military professionalism by democratic weakness. But the world had changed, and Montgomery had not changed with it. The British Empire's days of unquestioned dominance were ending. The United States was not a colonial subject to be managed. It was a superpower whose support Britain desperately needed. And Montgomery's failure to recognize this new reality made him not merely difficult, but dangerous. Churchill understood this with painful clarity. He knew that Britain's future depended on American goodwill, and that American goodwill was not infinite. Every offense, every slight, every moment of British arrogance eroded the foundation of partnership and pushed America towards isolationism or unilateral action. The internal British response to Montgomery was severe. Churchill's fury was widely known within government circles. Other British commanders, particularly those who worked closely with Americans, were mortified by Montgomery's behavior. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, and usually Montgomery's strongest defender, privately acknowledged that the press conference had been catastrophic. Even Montgomery's own staff recognized that he had crossed a line, though few were brave enough to tell him directly. The British military establishment understood what Montgomery did not, that winning battles was meaningless if you lost the alliance in the process. American commanders saw through the British damage control efforts. Eisenhower, who had tolerated Montgomery's behavior with remarkable patience throughout the campaign, was quietly furious. General Omar Bradley, whose forces had borne the brunt of the German offensive and whose soldiers had died by the thousands holding the line, considered Montgomery's press conference an unforgivable insult. General George Patton, never one for diplomatic restraint, expressed what many American officers were thinking. Montgomery was a coward and a fraud who had never taken the risks American forces accepted as routine, yet claimed credit for victories won through American blood. The damage to Montgomery's reputation among American military leadership was permanent and irreversible. From January 1945 forward, American commanders viewed him with suspicion bordering on contempt. His requests for resources were questioned. His strategic recommendations were dismissed. His future operations were scrutinized for any sign that he was prioritizing British interests over Allied objectives.
The repercussions of Montgomery's January 7th press conference extended far beyond immediate diplomatic embarrassment. What had begun as a general's arrogant attempt to claim credit for a battle transformed into a defining moment that reshaped Allied command structure, accelerated Britain's decline as a global power, and established the hierarchies that would define the post-war international order. Montgomery had not merely offended American sensibilities, he had inadvertently revealed the fundamental power dynamics that Churchill had been desperately trying to obscure. Britain was no longer an equal partner in the alliance. It was a dependent client state, and Montgomery's humiliation made that reality impossible to ignore. In the immediate aftermath, Eisenhower moved decisively to reassert American command authority. Montgomery's temporary control over American forces north of the Bulge Breakthrough was terminated as soon as operationally feasible. American armies were returned to American command structure, and future operations were planned with explicit provisions to prevent any similar arrangements. Eisenhower, who had previously tried to accommodate British sensibilities and maintain the fiction of equal partnership, abandoned those diplomatic niceties. The message was clear. American forces would fight under American command, period. British suggestions would be considered, but British generals would not direct American soldiers in combat except under the most extraordinary circumstances. This shift had immediate strategic consequences. Montgomery had been advocating for a narrow thrust strategy, a concentrated push into Germany under his command, prioritizing British axes of advance and British objectives. American commanders favored a broad front strategy that would advance simultaneously across multiple sectors, preventing German forces from concentrating against any single thrust. Before the press conference, this had been a legitimate strategic debate. After the press conference, Montgomery's narrow thrust proposal was dead. American commanders would not give Montgomery the resources and authority such a strategy required, not after he had demonstrated such contempt for American forces and such transparent self-interest in his strategic recommendations. Whether the narrow thrust or broad front strategy was militarily superior remains debatable among historians. What is indisputable is that Montgomery's behavior removed his preferred strategy from consideration. He had poisoned the well of trust so thoroughly that his military recommendations were now evaluated not on their merits, but through the lens of suspicion about his motives. American commanders assumed, often correctly, that Montgomery's strategic proposals were designed primarily to enhance British prestige and position British forces for post-war advantage, rather than achieve the fastest possible German defeat. This assumption made genuine strategic cooperation nearly impossible. The British government understood the magnitude of the disaster. Churchill's public rebuke of Montgomery was followed by private measures designed to limit further damage. Montgomery was quietly informed that future press contacts would require prior approval from political leadership. His communications with journalists were monitored. His public statements were scripted to avoid controversial content. Essentially, the British government placed one of its most senior military commanders under a form of political supervision that acknowledged his competence in military matters while recognizing his catastrophic incompetence in managing the political dimensions of coalition warfare. But the damage could not be fully contained. The American press had seized on the story, and the narrative of British arrogance became embedded in American popular consciousness. Newspaper editorials questioned whether Britain was a reliable ally or a fading empire attempting to exploit American strength for British imperial interests. Radio commentators speculated about post-war British intentions in Europe and Asia. Politicians in Congress began asking pointed questions about American resources being used to support British colonial ambitions. The carefully constructed image of Anglo-American partnership, two democracies united in common cause, had been fractured, revealing the underlying tensions and conflicting interests that Churchill had worked so hard to conceal. Montgomery himself never truly accepted responsibility for what he had done. In his post-war memoirs, he defended the press conference as an honest assessment of battlefield realities. He claimed that American sensibility and media exaggeration had transformed reasonable military commentary into an international incident. He positioned himself as a victim of political correctness, a professional soldier punished for telling uncomfortable truths. This narrative revealed how completely Montgomery misunderstood the nature of his offense. He genuinely believed the problem was American overreaction rather than his own arrogance. He never grasped that claiming credit for other men's sacrifices was not honest assessment, it was moral theft. This inability to learn from the experience meant Montgomery continued to create friction in the final months of the war. His relationships with American commanders remained poisoned. His strategic recommendations were consistently rejected. His operations were conducted with minimal American support and maximum American skepticism. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Montgomery was present at the formal ceremonies, but his role had been marginalized. The victory he had once expected to command as a British triumph was clearly an American achievement in which Britain had participated. The long-term consequences extended into the post-war order. American military leadership, shaped by their experiences with Montgomery and other British commanders, developed an institutional skepticism about British reliability and competence. This skepticism influenced American decision-making during the early Cold War. When Britain faced economic collapse and imperial retreat in the late 1940s, American support was provided, but it came with conditions that accelerated British decline. This special relationship that Churchill had cultivated was replaced by a more transactional arrangement in which American interests clearly dominated. Montgomery's press conference had also exposed deeper truths about the Anglo-American relationship that neither government wanted acknowledged publicly. Britain was bankrupt and dependent. America was ascendant and increasingly confident. The British Empire was disintegrating. American global influence was expanding. These realities would have emerged eventually, but Montgomery's arrogance accelerated the process. He had forced both nations to confront the power imbalance explicitly, making it impossible to maintain comfortable fictions about equal partnership. For Churchill, the episode represented a personal failure. He had invested enormous energy in managing the alliance, in balancing British pride with American power, in maintaining Britain's status as a great power even as that status became increasingly fictional. Montgomery's press conference had revealed the limits of Churchill's influence. He could not control his own generals. He could not prevent British arrogance from alienating Britain's most essential ally. He could not maintain the illusion of British greatness when that illusion depended on American willingness to pretend. The fury Churchill felt toward Montgomery was not merely about damaged diplomacy. It was about the exposure of British weakness at precisely the moment when projecting strength was most essential. The historical lesson extends beyond World War II command politics. Montgomery's failure illustrates a recurring pattern in declining powers, the inability of military and political elites to recognize and adapt to changing circumstances. Montgomery's worldview had been formed in an era of British dominance, and he could not adjust to a world where Britain was subordinate. His arrogance was not personal pathology alone, it was institutional culture, the accumulated confidence of generations of imperial power that could not accept diminished status. Britain's 20th century decline was driven partly by this inability to adapt, this persistent belief that British superiority was natural and permanent, rather than contingent and temporary. Modern military professionals study the Montgomery incident as a case study in coalition warfare failure. It demonstrates how personal arrogance can undermine strategic objectives, how cultural contempt can poison necessary alliances, how failure to understand political context can render tactical competence irrelevant. The lesson is clear. In coalition operations, managing relationships is as important as managing battles. Victory achieved through alienating allies is often worse than defeat, because it creates enemies for the future while solving problems of the present. Montgomery lived until 1976, long enough to see Britain's empire completely dissolved and British military power reduced to symbolic status. He never acknowledged that his behavior in January 1945 had contributed to this decline. He remained, until his death, convinced of his own genius, and convinced that history would vindicate his actions. In this, at least, he was consistent. The arrogance that had nearly destroyed the Western alliance in its moment of crisis remained unchanged through 3 decades of British decline. He died as he had lived, certain of his superiority, blind to his failures, unable to comprehend how his personal flaws had contributed to his nation's fall from greatness. Churchill's fury had been justified. Montgomery's secret contempt, made public in that disastrous press conference, had threatened everything Britain needed to survive. And though the alliance held, though the war was won, the damage was permanent.